Exactly. Exactly, stuff.
And we are recording.
Okay, it's beginning to stream, so you need to be quiet so it won't go out of the channel.
Sorry, dance party there for a second, everybody. Hello. Welcome to, got a couple more people coming in. Welcome to Interactive Audio is Different. I'm your one of two hosts, Bonnie Bogovich.
I'm your other of two hosts, Larry the O. And the third of two hosts didn't show up, so.
I guess we should start with a little background on who the two of us are actually speaking to you. I'm Bonnie Bogovich, so I've been working in interactive and video games for the last debatably 10 to 15 years, depending on what qualifies. And before then, I come from a background of stage direction and multimedia theater production. I work primarily in video games these days as a voice actor, director, and sound designer, where a majority of my professional life is spent as the audio lead at Shell Games. I worked on some VR titles like I Expect You to Die, Water Bears and Frostbound, and since then at my own production company, Black Hat Bonafide LLC, based in Austin, Texas, I've also been working on things like Cobra Kai, The Karate Kid Saga Continues, the latest G.I. Joe game, Death and Taxes, and currently I have a part showing up in Hell Architect, which should be pretty fun. So, oh, and in addition, I'm also at Here Now because I do a lot of work in the audio drama and audio fiction sphere. And one thing I like is that if any of you attended the Earplay panel, which happened yesterday, some of my work involves interactive audio fiction, which is finally bringing the crossover of audio plays are now turning into the game sphere and becoming a choose your own adventure type thing. So now I've got both worlds connected, and this panel will hopefully help clarify what interactive means. So Larry, tell us about yourself.
Well, my background is I started out in music and went to several schools for music, and along the way got involved in audio. And then from that, I got into doing audio post-production for film and TV. So I was really pretty steeped in linear media. And then some friends of mine at LucasArts recruited me, and I went up there, and oh boy, what a rude shock that was. I can remember, I mean, this was back in the day, and I can remember back in the day, I walked in and watched them mixing the end of a game called Full Throttle. And that basically consisted of them listening to the game as they played it, making notes, giving the notes to the programmer, and waiting to the next day to be able to see what the programmer did with them. I'm like, that's not mixing, that's insanity. And of course, it's come a long way now. I mean, the idea of middleware didn't exist at the time, and that makes a huge difference now.
Yeah.
So I did a bunch of games there. I went over to Electronic Arts and I did some games. And then after that, I did some more games freelance. I've done some other kinds of interactive audio, everything from device user interfaces to some site-based entertainment and things like that. And I'm currently sort of developing a concept for an interactive live performance thing. So, but that's still a ways out because it involves gesture recognition and other rather hairy things. So, but that's actually going to be story based. So we'll see. But in any event, in the process of learning interactive, there were two stages. One is just basically learning the technology and the techniques, but the other was understanding the concept, the difference in conception, which is probably one of the first things that we will talk about. And so that was just kind of really interesting to every once in a while something comes along where you have to kind of shift your worldview and rotate it a little to accommodate new information. And that's what interactive was for me. So.
And I'll quickly jump in just to say that description you had on, back in the day, things were mixed in this really weird way where you did stuff and the programmers took notes and maybe it was good the next day. Depending on what game company you work for and what project you're on, sometimes that's still how it goes. It's not ideal, but the world spins.
I'd say it's ugly, actually.
It can be very ugly. Yeah.
The programmers just don't understand the aesthetics of sound design and music and even, dialogue. So that can be very difficult to try and get them to get it right.
Yeah. Oh man, I think we're definitely going to hit on that on the platformy, et cetera, end of what we wanted to talk about. I think one big start is, so a lot of our audience is coming from an audiobook, audio drama, linear path universe. And for those of you unfamiliar with why we say linear, whenever you have an audio drama or a movie or something that has a specific timeline. So let's say you're watching a film and no matter what, at 20 seconds in, the little bunny goes, wee. And at 50 minutes in, there's a big fight scene. And at 1 minute and 45 seconds, I don't know, somewhere else there's the two people fall in love. So there's always a strict marker based thing where by the end, 1 hour and 30 minutes later, you're done and your kids go to sleep. That's linear.
The important point of this being that timeline is immutable. It can't be changed. It's always the same.
But yeah, non-linear.
And that has its advantages. I mean, that allows you to craft something very carefully and specifically because it's predictable. It's deterministic. You know what's going to happen when.
Yeah.
But interactive destroys all that.
And that's why I think our title is different. And there are so many ways you can say, but it's something very alien to people not used to thinking in that mindset, that if you're doing something where you want there to be choices, or your character can fight or eat a cookie, they can choose different things they do. And eventually maybe there's a fight scene, or they can come back and just not fight altogether. that is all a non-linear because it goes off the grid, it goes off the path, and there's no guarantee that at 1 hour and 30 minutes the credits roll. So if you're trying to think about, you really want to make your audio project interactive, it's good to think, you know, how and why and what would go into putting that together. So I think the first thing is like what we want to discuss. So you have a product and you want to make it interactive.
Let me just add something onto that. There are two really salient
Oh.
points.
You're a
that-
robot
that-
for a sec, Larry.
I'm a robot.
You sound like a robot.
I am a robot. Okay, well, am I human again, or is there
No,
some modulation going on?
can a very
Audio
quiet
looks
robot.
okay here.
Oh, now you're better.
Oh, must be a funky cable. We always love funky cables.
We were blaming things earlier on our cats. I think it might just say
Yes, that's right.
say a
And
cat did it.
now I'm on to cables. There are the two biggest, most salient points about the difference between interactive and linear is that in interactive, it's not entirely predictable what's going to happen. It's not totally unpredictable because there's usually a limited set of choices, but you can't predict exactly what is going to happen next. And you have to think about that in terms of how your audio gets put together. It's not just how does it sound now, but how's it going to sound when the next thing happens? And the other really important key point about it is you're not the one in charge of what happens next. The user is, the player is going to make those decisions. And we're somewhat limiting ourselves here deliberately to talking primarily about games and adventure style things, just because there are many different kinds of interactive audio and we don't have time to address more than that. But from that standpoint, those are the two most important things to keep in mind. You can't predict exactly what's going to happen, and you're not in control of exactly what's going to happen.
And then also, like, you have to make decisions like, first off, is the thing you're making, does it need to be interactive? Just saying you want to ride off the wave of something that's popular and go, oh, interactivity is the jam, everybody does interactive, I should have 4,000 choice points and blah, blah, blah. Does maybe your project is more meant for linear, but your interactivity might be just giving them some additional little quirky deviations along the way. It helps to find points of reference. Like, is there an interactive game out there that you think, that format would work really well for what I'm thinking? And part of that is, whenever you're talking to your writing team or whatnot, what platform is this game that you've seen that you think might be a good example of what you're trying to do? What about it really hooks you and makes you think that what you're working on can fit in that universe? And what do you really want to highlight audio wise in your universe if you're going to make it interactive? I'm trying to think. And
it's also worth mentioning that this is less true than it was before, but every platform does not have the same capabilities.
No.
There are basic capabilities that are pretty common across them, but some of them may be able to do better quality audio on the fly, or have better processing or more elaborate processing, such as being able to make something sound like it's in the next room and having occlusion and those sorts of things. So you have to understand what capabilities your platform has. And of course, that gets much trickier if your product is planned to be released on multiple platforms, because then you have to accommodate the fact that there'll be some capabilities on one version that won't necessarily be able to happen in the other version. But the key thing about platforms is they have a set of capabilities, and you need to understand what it is and play hopefully to those and not fight against them too much.
And just in case we have people in here who are wondering, we're throwing the word platform around there right now, and I realize some of you may not actually understand. So when you're listening to an audiobook, your platform might be Spotify or Apple Podcast. If you're listening to and Choose Your Own Adventure game that's out on the Echo, that is a platform. Audio playback home devices is a platform. Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, a bigger game console, that is a platform. And they all have really great things about them, but they also have limitations. And depending on what you really want to do with your game, how immersive, how sound and swelling or not, that can tell you how far you want to go and what you want to prepare for. Because the bigger the platform is too, the more code and research and knowledge needs to go in. And maybe you're writing something that could be simple and for the smallest possible thing, but it's good to know what platforms are out there and what you like about the existing ones and how you feel your story would benefit from being on any of those platforms. I guess like what's some examples of what we want to talk about? I feel like we had something else to say about platforms, but I lost my brain.
Yeah, it's getting towards the end of the festival. of-
Everyone else
lot of
feeling that
brain
it's
is-
Sunday right now? Man.
It is also worth mentioning that
Mm,
we talk about the platform, but that's only half of the delivery. The other half of the delivery is obviously what people are seeing and hearing.
mhm.
And nowadays, people are doing a lot more listening on earbuds and not necessarily on speakers.
Yeah.
And that's worth consideration, because if you're doing some sort of fight thing or some sort of war thing, you're not going to get great big explosions that are going to shake the earth, because there's just not going to be that kind of frequency response. And when
Mhm.
you try to pump something through with a lot of low frequencies, that takes a lot of energy, a lot of the speaker's energy, the earbuds energy. So if you're trying to pump great big explosions with lots of low end through earbuds, probably other things are suffering sonically because of it.
Yeah.
And they're also not getting that big low end. So, you have to keep, I mean, the platform is part of it. And then what the people are experiencing it through is the other part.
Yeah, one thing we discussed actually in the earplay panel yesterday was we used it as an example. So like a lot of the interactive audio tales we're working for have to be able to play on something as simple as this little Echo Dot, which is like, if you've seen the Echo, it's like this big. The Echo Dot is the more portable home version, and your speakers are these little air dots that are just around the top, and it has an okay sound. It's not meant to be bombastic, and you can Bluetooth it to some big immense speaker setup, but it's been designed to fit anywhere. And in the end, you're hearing a mono sound. So all the audio games that are being mixed for this have to sound good mono. There's no panning. You wouldn't put games on here that you expect to have a surround sound feel, obviously, because this might be in the corner of your office and so on. And it's the same thing if you're working on a game where surround isn't necessary. It's okay if you mix it knowing that on the worst possible earbuds, it's gonna be audible, because in that specific platform you're delivering it for, ideally you wouldn't be planning on anything that makes you feel like you're submersed in audio in a way that surrounds your head and gives you positioning. I think if you're like, so if your platform is something that can work on any phone speaker sitting on a table, something like this little guy, it's good to work on an idea that wouldn't also be pitched to Xbox, where you would have the surround speaker system and some really good headphones going on.
And it's not even just a matter of things like the surround. If you were doing it on Xbox, where you would assume that people have a better listening environment, the way that you would be constructing it and mixing it would be putting a lot more emphasis on things like sound design and ambience, et cetera. But if they're listening on that little Echo Dot, that's just going to obscure the dialogue. And so the whole way you're going to conceive of it and design it and mix it might be more exaggerated, in the sense that when someone is speaking, you're hearing very little, if any, sort of sound design or music. They're brought way back. And then when they're not speaking, you might bring it up so that it feels like it has more, atmosphere to it. But you'd have to be a little more exaggerated with it than if it's a good listening environment where you can have more subtlety to it.
Right. And also, I think one big important thing is how big is your team for this idea that you have? If it's just you and you don't actually know giant game platforms, and your whole plan is just to sell the story where the voice is the most important element, it's probably good to consider a simpler platform from the beginning, because it'll be easier for you to handle for your first time and to experiment with these ideas the first time, kind of thinking what interactive can be. Because once you enter into that world of like Xbox and bigger game systems, you need to start thinking coders on your team. You need to start thinking about positional testing and QA and a whole bunch of other elements that maybe are too overwhelming yet. Like personally, I would encourage people just getting into this to definitely, it's not bad to think smaller, because you can make a lot of big mistakes starting on a smaller platform.
Well,
But it
not
really
only that, but
Yeah.
a smaller platform in terms of performance is not necessarily a smaller platform in terms of market share.
Oh
There
no.
are probably fewer people with Xboxes than people playing games on phones and Echo. So,
Yeah.
although you feel like you're kind of staying scaled down and starting simple, doing that actually allows you access to a larger market. It's a whole different thing trying to do AAA games on console platforms. It's, as Bonnie was saying, it's a lot more involved in terms of the team and the production process,
Yeah.
but it's actually, a smaller market in the end. So there's nothing, don't be ashamed of doing something small and simple, because you'll actually be able to reach a heck of a lot more people with it.
Mhm. I think one point we first, I just forgot to mention, if anyone has any questions or you want us to clarify things, or there's a topic you want us to elaborate on, if you check the Zoom chat window, there's a link to a question form. So just feel free to spam us with things, especially if we hit a word or a phrase that you go, wait a minute, can you explain what ... means? We're happy to go in and elaborate. Sorry, I should have mentioned that at the beginning of the talk. I was about to say that we talked about having the choice of platform and thinking what you want to put it on. Sometimes it's a saving grace and a big relief if you are told from the get-go that, hey, we have this platform, we think interactive audio can work for it, here you go. Because then the decision's already made for you, and then you can go and research what the limitations and options are to be expressive are. Sometimes it is mentally daunting to go in and be told you can make your thing for anything, especially if you're new to this universe. But
If you,
yeah,
I would just like to reiterate in another way what Bonnie was saying. If you are new to it, ease yourself in, limit your scope. I mean, it turns out I've done a lot of project management, and one of the things I found out is projects go over budget and they go over schedule. They just do. And when I started doing project management, I did some research and bought some books. And one of them was written by a guy who'd been a Fortune 500 CEO. And in his intro, he says 75% of all projects go over budget and schedule. Well, I have to say, the only projects that I've worked on that have not gone over budget and schedule have been because they were defined with a limited scope, and they stuck brutally to that limited scope and did not allow it to creep. And in the end, it wasn't maybe as big and glorious a product, but it came in on time and on schedule. And so if you're just getting involved in it, there's so many ways things can go wrong.
Yeah.
You would be well served to try and limit your scope and not try to do too much the first time out. And what you'll find, I mean, the nature of creativity is that people get more creative when they're working against limitations. And so you will find that even if you've limited your scope, you're still going to come up with something really great if your imagination is at work.
Personally, I find that we're going to go into a little bit into mapping to a platform. I think if you're not sure how big you think your idea is going to be or could be, a great way to get started, if you're not familiar with flow charts of ideas, it's kind of like the flow mapping of routing audio, accessories and engines. If you think about it, like going from this will go to this and expand into a group of maybe two things. Take your idea. Let's say you have a straightforward audio play that you want to turn into sort of a choose your adventure format. People don't know that term. It's sort of, your character walks into a cave. They can go left or right, and you say left. And okay, what happens if they go left? Start drawing out all the possibilities. If you start branching beyond comprehension and it's too big, it's a good way visually, I think, to then pull yourself back in, and when you're planning a simpler thing, so that you know what your endpoints are. Maybe restrict yourself to a 30-minute story if you can for each possible route. But if you start drawing this giant spider web and it's not fulfilling to the player and it doesn't make sense and it feels like you've gone off the rails, it's just a good way to see what exactly you have in mind, I think, if that makes sense.
And if I can raise that to a more general point to be made about interactive in creative projects, especially ones that involve technology, there are two components. There's the creative component, which is the whole reason that we're all doing it, the fun part. But there's also the infrastructural side. And the infrastructural side is no fun. It's boring. It's
Yeah.
not really what we're inclined. But what you come to find out is it is the foundation on which the creative part is built. And if you don't deal with it, it will come back and bite you in the butt over and over and over again. So what that means is, because there are more possibilities in interactive, more different ways things can go, more assets that you have to cover all those possibilities, you really need to consider that there needs to be a more formalized process for your infrastructure, more documentation,
Oh,
more
yeah.
sitting down and making flow charts and thinking things through. If you
Mhm.
don't do that, you're going to find yourself painted into a corner multiple times. And you're going to find, I committed myself to this and now it's not working out. And now I'm halfway through the process and I have to start all over again in this one area. You don't want that to happen.
Mm.
So, you have to just bite the bullet. And the one upside, the silver lining is the infrastructure side is far more deterministic, which means if you get organized, you can just nail it to the wall. And that doesn't mean nothing unexpected will come up, but it means a lot fewer unexpected things will come up. And B, when unexpected things come up, you will have systems and structures in place that will allow you to handle them with a lot less pain. So just prepare yourself for the fact that you're going to have to do more paperwork, as it were, though we'll probably never actually see a piece of paper. But you're going to have to do a lot more of spreadsheets and lists and all the sort of stuff than you would otherwise do. And you will thank yourself later if you do that in the beginning. You'll hate yourself in the beginning, and then you'll love yourself later.
And it can be very frustrating, especially if you're used to just kind of writing a story where it has, like we said near the beginning, with the linear pathing of there's an obvious beginning, middle, and end, and nothing deviates, and everything ends out fine, and credits roll. Once you remember that that player is going to do whatever it wants, and you have to prepare for all the possible things they're going to do, it can be bonkers. But again, knowing the limitations of, by setting up those spreadsheets and those flow charts and those paths and knowing what you're building it for, it makes it better, because you're giving yourselves those walls. Like the player can do whatever they want within the paths I'm giving them. They can't just go off and change your jungle game into space if you did not build that pathing for them to do so. And again, I like thinking visually. If you draw this whole thing out and you're like, it's too big, and you just learn what you can cut. Like, he doesn't have to open that treasure chest and a squid jumps on his face. And maybe he just can't open the treasure chest, or maybe if he opens the treasure chest, it actually, I don't know, quickly jumps him to another part of the story that we don't need him to ever encounter all this stuff. Actually, we don't need that at all. Just cut that part out of our script. It's one other big thing, and this has come up in a lot of other panels. If you draw out these ideas, and whether it's a member of the team you're putting together or just a colleague, and you're like, here's my concept. It's kind of like the pitch panel yesterday. Here's what I have in mind. What do you think? And they are super confused, or they have some weird thoughts like, does this part really need to be there? Listen to that advice. Whether or not you take it, it's good to hear what someone removed from your project is thinking. Because especially if you're designing one of these things on your own, it's easy to get caught up in your brain and be so used to hearing the same things over and over again. You get kind of blinded to the outside world. It's always good to bring someone in at various phases to sanity check what you're doing.
And
maybe it's perfect, which is good too.
This is actually a perfect segue to a question from Sean. And he's saying, when you're writing when you're creating interactive fiction, do you want to be writing and designing for multiple resolutions to a story, or multiple paths that all merge? Well, first of all, that's a game design question. But really, the advice that I would give on that,
it's good though,
is especially if you're just getting started, consider it, think about it. I personally spend a lot of time just sitting and thinking, and not multitasking, but sitting and thinking, and consider from a practical standpoint how much work is being implied by each of those different things you're doing. So if you're talking about 3 possible different resolutions, that's not so bad. Now, if you have one resolution that it all comes to, then you could do your resolution once and it's going to be done for all of those paths. If you think about 8 different possible resolutions, that gets a lot more complicated. It's a lot more work. There are a lot more potential problems. So, you might be able to do that, but then you're talking about a larger project with a team and probably more of a budget and all that
It's
sort of thing.
it
So,
can get thick. Yeah. But
yeah,
one
so
thing,
you really just want to consider how difficult each of those choices will be when you're thinking creatively about which way you want to go with it. And
yeah.
as we've been saying over and over again, if you're doing this for the first time, start kind of small and don't worry about it being small, because you can still be creative even within a small, limited world.
Oh, sure. And I'm currently working on a project right now for the Echo, actually. It's going to be a interactive pirate musical game. And we decided, well, like we gave ourselves some limitations at the beginning, like we want the experience, no matter what path you choose, to be 30 minutes or less. Great. There are 3 possible endings that things can happen to. Great. Originally, it was more like 8 or 10, and we narrowed them down to 3 different enough solutions. And we decided that there can be a lot of crossover and reuse of assets where a lot of the same voice actions play. It's just the choices are different, and they're different enough that they eventually trickle off into their little tendrils of octopus arms into those 3 possible things. And it's hard because within those 3 possible legs, there's still some little flavor text things we threw in just to keep you feeling like you have a lot of choice. But no matter what, people still get the one ending file for each of those legs. So just because you're giving 3 endings doesn't mean those 3 you can have a little bit of fun getting to those 3 different endings. It's just still giving yourself that no matter what, boom happens at the end if these certain things happen.
That's a perfect example too.
Oh, you got your robot again.
Somewhere there must be a bad cable.
You nudged something at one point and it was fine.
And now it's gone away again?
Yeah, you're a robot again.
Weird. You're right.
Oh,
Aha.
and you're back.
Yeah, there's something there's an intermittent I'm going to have to find, but this is
Mhm.
not the time. I'm just going to have to
Yeah.
deal with that later. I hate that.
Uh,
That's a perfect example of thinking it through too, for a couple of ways. One is you guys rightly decided to limit the scope to 3 endings, but then you said, given that, how creative can we be? How far can we take those 3 endings? The other really great example of thinking it through, and I'm just trying to illustrate a thought process here for you people, is that you just kind of tossed off this idea that you could repurpose assets. Well, that's huge. Repurposing assets saves a lot of work.
It does.
And not only that,
because sometimes there's no reason to have to rewrite certain things.
That's right.
And for the audio team, not having to record 14 variations of someone going like, yes, that is dangerous, is fine. It can happen in multiple places.
And in some contexts, like on the consoles, on Xbox and that sort of thing, there's processing available where you can take an asset and make it sound different almost every time you hear it, but it's actually the same sound file. It only has to get created once. So, but the point being that this is the kind of forethought that I was talking about. You limited the scope and then said, now how can we keep it be fun? And then you limited the scope again by saying, how can we reuse assets? And so she's basically putting more emphasis on the creativity and less emphasis on the mechanics of creating lots of assets.
Yeah. I mean, there's still going to be a lot of assets because if we'd have just one ending. But the idea of making it still feel like you had a choice enough that the endings were different enough that we wanted people to come back more than once to play this game by saying it had these 3 endings and you get there and at the end we have a little like, that's how it could have ended, basically one of those clue sentences. If you want to make it interactive in a way that you encourage people to come back and see if it ends differently, make sure they know it at the end. So they come in. Remember to instruct your audience with your voice or text or whatever you have. That's another reason we kept it to 30 minutes was the hope was maybe someone had a really good time and they can play it twice in a day. The other thing is audio only. Maybe that's too long to be sitting on your couch and you really have other things to do. If we made our game 2 hours long, also knowing the limitations of, the dot, I had my right. Maybe you got distracted or your cat needs fed or suddenly you had to run an errand. Having a game that is short gives you more probability that they're going to play the whole thing through and come back. So I don't know, because we can't hit pause on an audio device as easily and visually as you could on an Xbox, where it just sits in a freeze frame and you come back later. Audio only devices, you forget that they exist and you come back to it later. So it's good to have it as a short, fun experience.
And again, just to keep hammering that nail into your skull, we're giving
Ouch.
a lot of techniques and specific examples, but the point of the entire thing is to emphasize the difference in the way you have to think about interactive and approach it. And the best way to illustrate that is to give all these different examples and specific techniques, because you're like, wow, I never had to think about that with an audiobook. And that's kind of the point. When you go into this thing, just be prepared to have to think differently. I mean, I have to tell you, when I started at LucasArts and I was given I was told to score an animation, do sound for an animation. And I said, okay, where's the animation? They're like, we haven't created it yet. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well, I'll give you a sound when we create it. And they said, no, we need a sound now so we can program it. Well, how am I supposed to do sound for picture when there's no picture? Well, we know you'll figure it out. That's why you're here. And I'm like, okay, so you just have to be willing to adjust your approach and your way of thinking. And that's the theme of the entire panel or whatever this is that we're doing.
And I think knowing, like, obviously we're at a festival where voice acting is one of the primary ways of storytelling, as well as Foley and sound. But one big thing about mapping something to a platform, and also in how you have chosen the platform you're in, is what kind of voice are you using in your game? If it's something like on the Echo, like one of these little dot devices, it's probably going to have some heavy narration or some very constant character voice that leads you along the way. Again, because even though lush sound design can be great, knowing that it's going to be a bit flatter than you would get on an Xbox, you can't rely purely on sound cues to be the whole thing that drives it. But maybe if you're doing an Xbox game, the very lush audio cued soundscape is suddenly the big thing that tells you how to play. And if you have any voices, it might be more minor or more NPCs and background characters leading you around. It's good to know how many voice actors also do you need to hire? Is it all just done with one voice? Are you the voice actor and this is your moment to shine, where you play everyone, or you're just the voice of God guiding everyone the whole way? Is the sound going to react to you touching things and everything else? Are we going to need the audio to play back to choices you make? Is it all just baked in, and no matter what, you don't like poke an object and it makes sound? So there's like humans that you need to think about, sound effects you need to think about. How are they going to be best used within the limitations of the platform, and how are they best going to serve the story that you're trying to tell? I think that's always the biggest angle, right? How is voice and sound going to sell your adventure through this interactive audioscape?
And since you bring up the viewpoint of voice talent, of narration, another big difference in interactive is that as a voice talent, it's a far more athletic enterprise than something like audiobooks, for several reasons. One, because there will often be multiple deliveries for the exact same line, not just so that they can choose between which one they like the best, but sometimes because there was one game I worked on where they had 3 or 4 different deliveries that led to different storylines. So the line might have been, well, that's true. And one delivery was just a very straightforward, well, that's true. And the second one was like a very sarcastic, well, that's true. And the third one would be something that would lead you to believe there was something else not being said, like, well, that's true. And each of those would lead to a different sub-storyline. So there they were using 3 different deliveries to take you into different places in the story. So you might have that. Then, of course, there's always multiple deliveries just to see which one you like the best.
Yeah.
Then there's the fact that there's tremendous numbers of lines that you're recording. And so you're speaking continuously for hours. So if you're doing some sort of funny voice, you can kill yourself that way if you're doing it for hours.
Yeah, quick example, Batman. If you guys like the Batman animated series, the original Batman voice was very gruff and very painful to listen to. Once the voice actor found out he'd have to sustain that for over like 35 episodes, Batman became a more smoother voice in the Batman animated series,
Right.
because he was physically harming himself. So it's always good to, if you have someone doing a lot of repetitive work and a lot of iterations, and sure, they can do a sound like they're being choked all the time. If they can't do that in a way that's going to not damage them permanently, don't torture your voice actors. Be kind to them. Our instruments are made of meat. Don't fry it.
Yeah. And, you're not doing big, long chunks like an audiobook. You're doing short little lines and you're doing a whole lot of them all in a row. So it's a very different kind of experience as voice talent. And that's another good thing that's worth keeping in mind in terms of interactive being different.
Someone mentioned, I think Casey Kasem or one of the other Scooby-Doo voice actors did damage his voice from being Shaggy all the time. I believe that, if that is true. It's like, oh, Scoob, yeah, do that all day. 4,000 takes, 20 iterations. One of the things too, in interactive, if you're doing stuff that involves fight scenes or people being punched or dying a lot, often people do not do, you punch a person, they go, ow, 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 ow. You're gonna, my mother, you're gonna have to write out those iterations for them, or make a line item that they need, 5 to 15 versions. Also, depending on when you encounter them in the game, were they already mortally wounded when you started beating them up? Were they fresh off another fight? Are you kicking a dead horse? The dead horse might make sound. But it's good to, you're going to have to list all of these things out. I think I maybe mentioned earlier that, I can't remember if it's this talk or the previous one, that normally when you have your audio play or your audiobook, things might be written in a script format, in like a movie script, teleplay script format. Once you enter interactive, even if it's the branching of the choose your own adventure side, you leave that format very soon and go into spreadsheet land. So if you're not used to writing out your scripts and your text and your dialogue and everything that happens in spreadsheets and cells, that's something you should get accustomed to pretty fast, because not only will things be written in order, you then need to, between either you or your team, have to learn to develop file names, file name systems. So whoever, whether it be you or your tech team, can know that, the first line in the play is like NT16-5, and that once you get over to another point, it can either go to NT16-3, NT16-4, NT16- whatever. Because once those things are locked in programming, you may adjust the text later, but that file name is very important, because that's what's going to keep things flowing properly.
And that's the infrastructure issue that I was referring to earlier, is exactly that.
Yeah.
One other thing about delivery and working as a voice talent is, we're talking about doing multiple takes to see which one you like the best, doing multiple takes that might lead to different story plot lines, but there's also doing multiple takes for things you don't need, because the game might change and you might turn out to need a different delivery of the line altogether, because the game designer changes something because things are running late and they had to cut out a level, and now they need this to be angry rather than curious or something.
Yeah, it's always good to be prepared, especially if you're on a larger team, that plans change. Things change all the time. Things can always be cut. And to not take it personally and roll with it, and just do your best to still make things glue together in a way that makes sense. And like Larry said, it might be as simple as that line used to be neutral and now it's angry, or the name of the character that you're talking about has shifted, or the name of the city it takes place in. But it's keeping that consistency going and just making it sound as natural as it can, so that the audience listening or playing this thing never senses that there was a giant cut or, a plot hole that had to be patched. If they don't hear anything weird or broken, then you did a good job. Man, phew, it's been a couple days, everybody. I guess we could talk about expressiveness and how to make things expressive. Do we want to go in that angle? Anyone have any questions that that they'd like to, anything unclear or too fuzzy at this point before we keep going? We have 20 minutes left, so if you haven't asked any questions or have points, please use the form to fill them out, and we'll do our best to get to them. I think our brains are starting to stop. It's that part of a weekend. Yeah, I guess the summary is whenever you have your platform and you know your limitations, whether you set them yourself or you know what they are based on what you're working on, it's your job and hopefully your joy to discover what are the best ways to use that to make the most immersive and expressive experience you can do with the audioscape that you have access to, you know? I'd say whenever you can, other than I mentioned the helpers thing, once you start having even rough versions of your game, and I've done this with the pirate game, actually. We had paper prototypes of our interactive game. It's not programmed yet, but we have all the file names created. We have all the scripts laid out by identifiers, and we have a test PDF. So someone currently, when we do a playtest, pretends to be the computer or the game device. And we've been doing Google Hangout chats where someone's the player and they can't see anything because it's an audio only game, and somebody narrates how the game goes on the other end, and they follow their layout via PDF of how it would happen in real time and does their best to act it out because we haven't recorded the final audio yet. And we've found tons of bugs and holes and things to fix just by having a naive player go through this experience. In game world, this is sometimes called a paper prototype or cardboard prototype because there's no actual digitalness going on other than the existing spreadsheet, you know. But if a human plays the computer and just simulates what the experience would be, you can learn a ton.
I love doing this. Now let me generalize what Bonnie just said a little more.
Other than paper prototype or
well, but what I was going to generalize and say, this is another aspect in which interactive audio is different, and that is a large and crucial aspect of the entire development process is testing. In one form or another, whether it's paper testing or whether you have something functional and you do play testing or whatever, but you will change things, and you almost certainly will change fairly major things based on early play testing of whatever sort, whether it's paper or whether it's actual functional. But because there are so many different paths and ways things can go, some of them might work fine the first time and others aren't going to work quite as well. Or as Bonnie says, they might work great until you suddenly realize that they don't connect the way they're supposed to connect. And you're like, who forgot to put that pipe in between here and here? Uh-oh, we got to write a story piece and then, you know, record stuff and put that together. So it's a really crucial part of the entire process. And if you don't plan for that, if you don't leave some time and resources, then what you're going to get to what you think is the end and suddenly realize it's actually another 20% down the line that you have to do.
Yeah.
So that's another big difference with interactive. Certainly you don't have that with audiobooks at all. Once it's written.
Yeah.
But, you know, even writing like linear audio fiction, you don't get the same degree of change happening once you've got drafts that you like as you do with a game or interactive audio, where you sort of have to build some of it and try some of it before you really start to see the things that need to be redone.
And what's really nice is like we're currently doing our play tests with human voices because we also have, it's a musical, so there's sing numbers in the middle. But one thing you can do if you're building something like the Alexa, the system that does the Echo Dots and everything else, they have a free programming kit where anyone can make interactive stories, and there's a template. And you can, at the start, it just lets you use the normal robot voice that comes built in. We aren't doing that for our playtest because we know we wanted to really have the emotion and the musicality sell through the playtests. But you can test simple interactivity just using what's built in. It's just, you know, keep in mind, hopefully, that you're going to replace it later with actual WAV files of voice actors saying things properly and everything else. But man, testing earlier without recording is great because there's nothing like recording, because I've done this for games where we've had to record all the dialogue, right? And there can be 3,000 files that are planned. If a writer is going to change stuff midway, you have to redo a ton of work depending on how much they're going to do. The more testing and finalizing of text you can do up front will save you endless hours. It'll save the time of you for preparing for those sessions, the voice actors for doing those sessions. It'll save money for paying the voice actors and the editors to work on those sessions. Just
Another way of doing that. And this
oh,
is a-
nudge your cable.
cable. I think,
And when you're recording your talent, make sure your cable's not defective.
no, I don't think it's the cable.
Actually, I think
Oh.
it's a glorious piece of
There you are.
of of boutique classic analog audio that is probably getting old. I think that's what's going on. Because I have a beautiful DBX 160 compressor, and I'll bet you it's getting old. Anyway, there is another technique that helps here and helps in various other places of development, and that is just the concept of placeholders. So what you
Mhm.
can do is you can write all your dialogue, and then you can have anybody. It can be you. It can be
Yeah.
your mailman. It doesn't matter. Sit down and just read through all the lines. They don't have to
Yeah.
be good readings. They don't have to be dramatic readings. You just read through, because then you get at least a feeling for how the dialogue flows, how timing works out, and things like that. Even if the acting isn't there at all, it still is really helpful. And
Yeah.
it also gives you assets that you can go ahead and program with that glorious file naming
name,
schema
yeah.
that Bonnie referred to. And then you're miles ahead. I mean, you
Oh,
record
man.
your final, you give it
Yeah.
the final names, and you just overwrite the old stupid files with the new glorious files, and it's done. It's there. It's in place.
I've
So the
actually
idea
had-
of placeholder assets is
Yeah.
really powerful.
and those placeholders can be a full read of the line, like you said. I've even done ones where placeholders are for the sound effects, and it's like fish sound goes here is the sound of the fish sound once it goes off, just so later, and if it goes off while people are playing QA, at least we know that fish sound is hooked up properly. That file has been hooked up. It just hasn't been created yet. So later when I go in and swap in the right fish audio, I just save it the same file name, and magically it'll now be linked where it's got to go. Your placeholder could also be really cool fight scene, dialogue not written yet. Maybe that's the little text that goes in there. But the
Yeah, for
important
so-
thing is that name is proper.
For sound effects, I often used to use a really obnoxious sound as the placeholder,
So it's
because that made it
obvious.
really obvious the things that hadn't been replaced with final assets yet.
Like a
You'd be playing along,
foghorn.
they would suddenly go, and they say, "Ooh, that's terrible." So it made sure things didn't get missed.
Yeah. There was a whole experience I did for SeaWorld, actually. It was an interactive turtle thing. And often you would hear turtle eating crab, turtle eating clam. It's like, and later I'm like, I know, we haven't recorded that yet, but at least you knew that him eating the right object made the proper thing go off. You know what I mean?
So this is all another angle on the idea that interactive audio is not deterministic, that the entire process of developing it, as well as the process of playing it, is
Mhm.
all an evolutionary process that changes a lot. And that's part of how you have to think of things differently. It's not like you just decide how you're going to do it and you do it.
Yeah.
You decide how you're going to do it, and then it's going to get changed a whole bunch. So
Yep.
you don't want to commit yourself totally to any one direction until you've tried a bunch of stuff and you feel pretty confident that this is the right thing, and usually you don't even get to a point where you decide that. Usually it just kind of evolves to the right thing, and then it's there. And there
Yeah.
not actually a point where you say, okay, this is it. This is how we're going to do it. You kind of arrive at that point, and there it is,
And I will say, for anyone who's like, oh, and once something ships, it never changes, right? As someone who's worked on Wasteland 3 and its DLC content and its upcoming DLC content, I can tell you, especially on bigger budget games, patches come through and things keep changing sometimes even after the ship date. So always be ready, even after it's like, and it's launched, that it might not be done. Your job might not be done. Those files might still keep morphing. It's just, you got to go with it. There was actually a question that came up about file naming schemes. It's a
Yes.
good one. Can you give more details about this is from Nico, about file naming schemes. Give more details about best practices in file naming or things to avoid. I know my biggest pet peeve for file names, and it's always justified, is do not put the name of the scene or what the current description of a scene is in your file name. Unless it's voiced by a character, maybe sometimes the character name can go in there. But if you name the scene, odds are half the time people change the name of what the scene is going to be. So if at the beginning of production, it's like, oh, that's in a cafe, and all these files have the word cafe in it. halfway through the year, they delete the cafe and now it's a zoo. So then the people in programming town later on are like, I can't find all the zoo files. All I have are these cafe things, and everyone's confused. I prefer personally numeric and letter-based code identifiers if possible. If there's scenes and dialogue, maybe if it's always an exposition or something, using an E for that at the beginning, and D for dialogue, and something simple like that. And then a numbering system after. If you are using numbering in any file names, don't ever just start with 1, 2, 3, 4. Build in a couple zeros at the beginning of anything with numbers. Anyone who's a coder background will know what I'm talking about. You don't start counting at 1. Counting starts at 0, but leave room to grow, because depending on how big your file, your game is going to be, you might need up to 300 dialogue lines. And if you only left numerical stuff for so many, when someone sorts all this data in alphabetical order, without those zero pads, things shift into funky ways. So that's me. My big thing is don't type out scene names or names of chapters. Like, avoid that in your file names.
There are a couple of more foundational ideas. One is you're going to have multiple pieces of information that you want to try and contain in this file name. And that leads to a couple different considerations. One is, what order are they going to be in?
Mhm.
Usually, to a fair degree, this is not absolute, but to a fair degree, you want to have the most important thing first and then second, and break it down. However, there's not a single thing that determines what's the most important. You might want to organize it by scene, although you would use scene designation and not name.
There you go. Designation is the term.
Yes, exactly. But the point is, it might be
Yeah.
by scene, or it might be by character, or it might be by some other, means of organization. So that's going to vary from context to context. You have to decide what your fundamental level of organization is, what's the primary thing you're trying to sort on, as it were, and put that first. A second consideration is legibility versus compactness. So, it's really, programmers love when everything's just coded and it's just it's numbers and just really short numbers. And that works really well in terms of working with software, et cetera. But it's harder if you're looking at it and trying to determine what it is. There's a lot more interpretation that's needed. To make that easier, you would write things out like a character's name instead of just the first 3 characters, but that makes file names a lot longer. So again, there's not one right way to do this, but you have to look at these considerations. It's easier to read when you look at it if you write things out, but it makes file names longer, which can get unwieldy. It's very compact if you can make it short. So a good compromise might be if you can find 3 characters or 4 characters that allow you to designate any one of 15 or 20 character, dramatic characters. Right. You might use 3 letters or whatever. And that's fine. If you have 50 dramatic characters, that's not going to work as well. Then it's suddenly going to be much more cryptic trying to figure out which character it is. So you want to watch out for the length. You want to strike a balance in terms of readability, and depending just on what you think is going to be necessary. You want to try and make sure that you're covering multiple bits of information. You will need to have multiple bits of information in the name. One of my pet peeves is don't use spaces, because coding, it's a big pain in the neck. So just use underbars or whatever. And avoid all the things you usually have to avoid in file names. So, weirdo special characters and things like that. Try and keep it pretty straightforward. Use things like, capitalization at the beginnings of some things and not of other things, just in a logical fashion. There isn't like an absolute rule about how to do it. Just, you want something where you can look at the file name, and worst case, you can figure out what it means, even if you can't tell at a glance. And it encapsulates all the information that you need. The reason for ordering it is because you may need to sort it. If you have a lot of lines, you may need to be doing automated processes like sorting or batch file renaming or things like that. So you want to be thinking in those terms when you create your file name schema. You want to document it, because you might have to hand somebody else files. Somebody might be recording a character elsewhere, and you want the files to not come back with completely different kinds of names. So you want to be able to send them, here's our schema. The first 3 characters indicate the character. Then there's an underbar, and then the second 3 blah, 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 blah.
It's very important that if you do have something like that, that everyone just understands how the file name breaks down, what the translation is into English. I'm gonna copy. I had to change
And
part of it.
don't let anybody change them.
Oh,
In
and
the
yes,
old days,
after
the
that,
programmers used to change the file names to suit
Man.
themselves.
it's bad.
And what
No.
the problem that you come into there is if you iterate and you create another version of that file and somebody has changed the file name somewhere downstream, you can't just substitute your new file for the old file. It won't work. So once file names are created, that's it. That they have to live that way all the way down the line. If somebody doesn't like it, that's tough toenails for Tony, you know,
Yeah,
and not Tony Brewer.
and I pasted an example of a client I'm currently working with, and between me and their tech team, this is the scheme they ended up coming with for it's sort of a motion comic with some choice pathing. And we came down, and there's a ton of characters and a ton of chapters, but this is what what they decided between me and them, what they want. This is going to be a voice file. So it's voice hyphen chapter underscore 001 hyphen 02 underscore 02 Laura. And the way this actually comes out of a spreadsheet of all the lines that I record with my talent. And it's all broken down and everything outputs to the end to this file name. So in this case, it is a voice file for their knowledge. It happens in chapter 1. Note that we did 001 because this game may end up having 300 chapters. Scene 202 because there's never more than 6 scenes. Line 2, and the character's name is Laura. And throughout the spreadsheet that they made that outputs to this, all that data always spews out this for everything in the game. And this cannot be changed once it has been made. It is locked. So this has gone after 2 phases of content lock. And the nice thing is, with this much buffer, if things fall a little out of line, it's okay because at least the chapters and scenes are there and in a sort of understandable format. And they've invented a thing where we actually can add stuff in between. So for example, if I, let me see. Whenever I'm looking at stuff, if we want to add something between line 3 and 4, periods are actually an accessible part of the file names that they're using. So it would be 3.3.1, 3.2, 3.3. They've built it in. So if we have to squeeze things in the middle, we can. But again, in my tracker that I have access to and the whole team has access to, we also have a handy notes column. I always recommend when you have a file sheet, if there's anything funky, there's some column with a field that you can type if you're confused or something needs clarification or they need clarification on how it fits. Because sometimes things are going to go out of order, but as long as there's a place that everyone's on the same page as to how it's funky, it's great. Never leave anything assuming that people will understand just a code fix of what's going on. There needs to be an understanding of communication, whether it's in the sheet or in Slack, something, just same page, all good. Boo boo.
Now, what I would see that might get added to that schema there, especially from the standpoint of recording, whether or not it's in the final, is possibly a number to indicate the take, which take it is. And this brings you to another reference back to what I was talking about in terms of readability versus compactness.
Mhm.
If Laura might deliver the scene angrily or happily, might deliver the line angrily or happily. For readability, you might have ANG001, ANG002, and HAP001. But for compactness, you might have documented that elsewhere. And it might just be these takes are all the takes that were angry takes. These takes were, and then you'd have to go to that reference to see it, but the file name itself would be far more compact.
And
but the point is,
in that example, that is kind of what's going on. But those files exist, knowing between me and the people who are approving dialogue through another system, because what this file name is for is what is hooked into the game for what is coming out. Because in this game, we don't actually have the branching of those 3 types of dialogue. In this case, the wording is actually different for the angry, delivery, et cetera, et cetera. And there's actually a line, a 1, a 2, and a 3 that they've already scripted and how they wanted it to be those. But no matter what happens in the game, if I change the mix or the delivery of this file, it's already hooked in and it's going to play as intended. So, but then this is just one example of one specific type of client, and this is how they had it. And everybody's different. Like this file naming scheme won't be the same for everyone. I would have preferred not to have the word chapter in there or even voice, but they're dumping everything in a very code-like manner. And for their team, they preferred to have just so they could eyeball it. Like Larry was saying, sometimes if you're looking at a stream of files, you want to know what that is right away. Seeing that voice was enough for them to go boom, because I found out later it's because the sound person, who's not me, because I'm outputting WAV files, they're outputting stuff, and theirs are SFX dash blah, and mine are the voice dash blah. Maybe it could have been simplified with V dash chapter blah or V dash C instead of chapter. But again, this was a back and forth, and this is what the production agreed on. So I work within the scheme because
And the salient thing there is they decided the most important thing was, are these voice lines? Are these SFX lines? Is this a
Correct.
music file?
Mhm.
And so that's why that's the first piece of information that's there.
Exactly.
And I think
So
we're-
you
think
sort it
we're
all,
about-
and it all lines up based on the first main important category identifier. Yes.
I think we're up against it.
Oh yeah. So thank you everyone. Good questions. There's obviously a ton that goes into all these forms of interactive, but we hope we helped make it a little less scary or break it down for you who are completely new to it. Yeah.
I can tell you it was scary when I first dove in, but then once I figured out how to make sound for picture that didn't exist, it wasn't so bad. And by the way, the answer to that is placeholder. That's how you make sound for
Actually-
picture that doesn't exist, is you do placeholder until the picture exists. If they
Right.
tell you what it's going to be, then you can just do something rough. If they don't tell you what it's going to be, then you can just do an obnoxious noise.
I think that's actually good advice. If anything, one of the best tips throughout this whole thing. If you want put something into a game that you definitely don't want to be final, make it very clear that it should not ship with your game. Otherwise, many things I've seen go through that should have been temp have gone through. And the danger there too is if you're using a sound you don't own or text you don't own as your placeholder, like a copyrighted piece of music, it could ship, and then you might be putting your team in danger of being sued. So if it's going to be fake or not real, make it very obvious that that should not go. Another
There was a
reason to do
placeholder-
PA.
There was a placeholder file that shipped, and I did not make this file, that shipped in a LucasArts game, fortunately in a very obscure place where somebody had done a voice placeholder that had nothing to do with the line. They just actually might even been sound effects. I don't remember. But what they did was they just opened up a mic and said, "Worship Satan." And it didn't get
Oh.
caught, and it shipped that way. Needless to say, somebody found it and there were complaints.
Oh my gosh. Well, on that lovely note, thank you guys for joining us. It's been a great here now. We hope you enjoyed the rest of your fest. There's more content that started a couple minutes ago. So thank you. And thank you, Larry, for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
I think it was Larry's idea to do this panel too. So thank you, Larry, for wanting to do the panel. But yeah,
All
thank
right.
you all. Enjoy your
See-
fest.
And
How do
now
I-
we're waiting for David to stop
Yeah.
the stream.